The invoice arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a stiff, cream-colored envelope that felt cold to the touch. It didn't have a return address, only my name, Imani, and my street, written in a swirling, unfamiliar calligraphy. Inside, there was no letter, no card, no explanation. Just a single, glossy sheet of paper. At the top, in elegant font, it read, "Wedding expenses for Alara and Julian." My breath caught. I ran my finger down the itemized list, each line a small, sharp cut. Venue deposit, Harbor Grand Estate, $25,000. Couture gown fitting, Monique Louillier, $12,000. Artisanal floral design, $8,500. On and on it went, a litany of luxury I couldn't comprehend. At the bottom, in bold, was the grand total, $90,000. But that wasn't the part that made my heart stop. It was the handwritten note scrawled in the margin, in my granddaughter Ilara's looping script. "Grandma, we'd be so grateful for your help making our day perfect. We know you'd want this for us." It was a command disguised as a request, an invoice masquerading as a plea for family support. The most brutal part? I hadn't even been invited to the wedding. Just 2 weeks prior, my son, Samuel, had called me, his voice thin and reedy, like a signal losing its strength. He'd stammered about Ilara and her fiancé, Julian, wanting a more modern and streamlined event. He'd used words like aesthetic curation and intimate guest experience. Finally, after I'd pressed him, the truth came out, delivered with the pathetic apology of a man who has surrendered his own spine. They felt my presence would be complicated, that I was too old-fashioned, a relic from a different time who wouldn't understand the vibe they were trying to create. I was a loose thread on their perfectly woven tapestry. So here I sat, in the quiet of my late husband David's study, the scent of his old books and pipe tobacco still clinging to the air, holding a bill for a celebration of love from which I had been formally unloved. They didn't want my presence, but they demanded my savings. They had severed the root, but still expected the tree to bear fruit for them. Before I continue this story, take a moment and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe that family is more than just a line of credit, please consider liking this video and subscribing. You won't want to miss how this ends. I stared at the invoice, the number seeming to pulse with a life of its own. $90,000. The sum of a lifetime of careful saving, of overtime shifts David had worked, of vacations we'd forgone. It was the nest egg meant to carry me through my final years with the dignity he had always insisted upon. My first instinct was to burn it, to let the ashes scatter in the wind and send them a picture of the remains. But that was a response born of anger, and anger is a fire that consumes the person holding it. David had taught me that. "Wrath is a storm, Imani," he'd say, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "Let it pass over you. The real work is done in the calm that follows." And as I sat there, the initial shock gave way to a cold, clear calm. I saw the invoice not as an insult, but as an opportunity. They had made a critical error. They had mistaken my age for weakness, my quiet life for ignorance. They saw an old woman, a widow, someone to be managed, and if necessary, placated with empty words while her pockets were emptied. They had forgotten I was the daughter of a sharecropper who learned numbers by counting pennies in a jar. They had forgotten I was a high school math teacher for 40 years, a woman who understood that every equation must be balanced. They thought they were sending a bill. What they had actually sent was a declaration of war. And in this war, they had given me the most powerful weapon of all, the checkbook. A strange smile touched my lips, one I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the smile of a predator that has just seen its prey walk willingly into a trap. I picked up the phone not to call my son and scream, not to call Ilara and weep. I called my financial advisor. "Bernard," I said, my voice steady, "I need to liquidate some assets, and then I want you to help me set up a very specific, very restricted trust. Let's call it the Ilara and Julian Wedding Fund?" There was a pause. "A trust, Imani? That sounds wonderful. What are the terms?" I leaned back in David's old leather chair, the cool material a comfort against my skin. "The terms, Bernard," I said softly, "are that I, and only I, have the power to authorize every single payment, down to the last cent." They wanted me to pay. Fine, I would pay. But they were about to learn that my money came with a price far steeper than $90,000. It came with my values, my history, and a lesson in respect they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. I looked at the invoice again, this time seeing not just the numbers, but the spaces between them, the gaps in their understanding, the holes in their plan. They thought this was a transaction. I was about to make it an education, and the first tuition payment was due immediately. The day after the invoice arrived, a profound and chilling quiet settled over my house. It was the kind of silence that follows a declaration of war, when both sides are gathering their forces, and the air itself seems to hold its breath. I spent the morning in the garden, my hands buried in the cool, dark earth, my mind a whirlwind of strategy. David and I had planted this garden together, and every rosebush, every lavender sprig was a living memory. He used to say that you could tell a person's character by how they tended their soil. Some people just throw seeds down and expect a harvest. Others, the ones who understand life, they nurture, they prune, they protect. Ilara, it seemed, had forgotten how to tend to anything. She just wanted the bouquet, already cut and arranged. That afternoon, I drove to the bank and met with Bernard, my financial advisor for over 20 years. He was a kind, meticulous man who had helped me navigate the financial labyrinth of David's passing. He looked at me over the rim of his spectacles, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. I explained the situation, leaving out the rawest parts of the emotional betrayal, focusing instead on the mechanics of my plan. I wanted a trust, an escrow account, legally structured so that I was the sole signatory. No funds could be released without my explicit, written approval for each specific vendor. "So, you'll pay for the wedding," Bernard clarified, tapping his pen on a legal pad. "But you'll function as the project manager, a financial gatekeeper." "Precisely," I said. "I want to review every contract, every invoice. I want to know what a tablescape consultant does to justify a $5,000 fee. I want to understand the economics of custom-dyed silk napkins." Bernard's lips twitched into a small smile. He had seen enough family drama over his career to read between the lines. "This is an unusual arrangement, Imani, but it's perfectly legal. It gives you complete control. You can approve the caterer, but deny the ice sculptor. You can fund the venue, but refuse to pay for the valet service." "Perfect," I whispered. We spent the next hour drawing up the documents. As I signed my name, the same name they had deemed unworthy of an invitation, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Not the loud, arrogant power Julian and Ilara chased, but the quiet, unshakable power of a woman who knows her own mind and her own worth. That evening, I made the first payment. I authorized a wire transfer for the $25,000 venue deposit directly to the Harbor Grand estate. I even sent Ilara a short, simple text message. "Handled the venue deposit. So happy to help you make your dream come true." I knew this act of compliance would be crucial. It would lull them into a false sense of security. They would see the money flowing and assume they had won, that the old woman had folded, just as they expected. They would believe their manipulation had worked. This was a critical part of the lesson. Allow your opponent to underestimate you. Give them the rope and trust that their own arrogance will fashion the noose. Late that night, the phone rang. It was Samuel, my son. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with a forced, syrupy gratitude that made my stomach turn. "Mom, Ilara told me you took care of the venue. Thank you. Really, it means the world to her, to us." I kept my voice level, betraying none of the cold fury that simmered just beneath the surface. "Of course, Samuel. She's my only granddaughter. I want her to be happy." "I know this whole invitation thing was awkward," he continued, stumbling over the words. "But Julian's family, they operate in a different world. There are expectations, appearances to maintain. It's not personal." The lie was so blatant, so insulting, that I almost laughed. "Not personal?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Samuel, you are my son. You were raised in this house. You watched your father work 2 jobs to make sure you had a better life than he did. You held his hand as he died in a room paid for by a lifetime of quiet, unglamorous dignity. And you're telling me that excluding his memory and his wife from your daughter's wedding is not personal?" There was a long, heavy silence on the line, filled with everything he was too cowardly to say. I could hear his shallow breathing, the sound of a man drowning in his own weakness. "Mom, you're making this difficult," he finally whispered, his voice cracking with frustration. It was the same tone he used when he was a boy, and I'd caught him in a lie. The blame shifting, the victimhood. "I'm not making anything difficult, Samuel. I'm asking you to remember who you are, who your father was. But perhaps that's too much to ask." He sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. "Look, Julian is a good man. He's an investment banker. He's giving Ilara a life I never could. This wedding is important for his career. It's a networking event as much as a celebration. You have to understand the bigger picture." "The bigger picture?" I asked, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "The picture I see is of a son who is allowing his daughter to trade her family for a seat at a table where she'll never truly belong. I see a man who is so dazzled by the shine of his future son-in-law's world that he's become blind to the darkness it's casting over his own." Before he could respond, before he could offer another flimsy excuse, I said, "I have to go, Samuel. I'm very tired." And I hung up the phone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, the sting of my own son's betrayal a fresh, open wound. It was worse than Ilara's greed. Her actions were born of youthful folly and the poisonous influence of a man I was beginning to suspect was more predator than prince. But Samuel, he knew better. He knew the cost of our lives, the sacrifices made. His betrayal was not an act of ignorance. It was a choice, a deliberate decision to trade his mother's honor for his daughter's social advancement. And that, I realized, was a debt that could never be repaid with money. The calm I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet, searing dread. This wasn't just about teaching a lesson in respect anymore. This was about saving my family from a rot that had spread deeper than I ever imagined. The game had changed. The stakes were no longer just financial, they were existential. I was no longer just a gatekeeper of funds. I was the last line of defense for a family legacy that was being sold off, piece by piece, for a fantasy. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the next move had to be mine, and it had to be far more aggressive than simply controlling the purse strings. I needed information. I needed to understand the enemy. The phone call with Samuel left a residue of grief that clung to me for days. The betrayal of a child is a unique and profound sorrow, one that hollows you out from the inside. But grief, I have learned, can be a powerful motivator. It can sharpen your senses, clarify your purpose. My purpose, I now understood, was not simply to control the wedding expenses, but to uncover the truth behind this elaborate, $90,000 facade. I was a teacher for 40 years. I knew that the answer to a problem is rarely found on the surface. You have to show your work. You have to dig. My investigation began with the man at the center of this web, Julian. I started where anyone my age with a problem they don't understand begins, on the internet. I typed his full name, Julian Croft, into the search bar. The first results were exactly what I expected. A polished LinkedIn profile boasting a position as a vice president of acquisitions at a boutique investment firm I'd never heard of. There were articles in obscure financial blogs quoting him on market trends, and a handful of photos from charity galas where he stood slightly behind more prominent city figures, smiling a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a carefully curated digital footprint designed to project success and influence. But it felt thin, like a stage set. There were no family details, no mention of his upbringing, no university alumni networks. It was as if he had materialized out of thin air 5 years ago. This was my first red flag. People with real legacies, real foundations, have roots that show. Julian's were conspicuously absent. Next, I examined the vendors Alara had listed: the Harbor Grand Estate, the couture designer, the floral artist. They were all the most expensive, most exclusive service providers in the city. But they also had something else in common: ironclad contracts and non-refundable deposit policies. They catered to a clientele for whom money was no object, but they protected themselves fiercely against those who might get cold feet. It was another piece of the puzzle. This wedding wasn't just extravagant. It was financially high stakes. Canceling would mean forfeiting tens of thousands of dollars. They were locked in. But who had locked them in? As I delved deeper, I realized I was an amateur playing a professional's game. I needed help. I needed someone on the inside, someone who could see what I couldn't. My mind turned to a name I hadn't thought of in months: Chloe. Chloe had been Alara's best friend since middle school. They were inseparable, two halves of the same whole. But in the last year, since Julian's arrival, Chloe had faded into the background. I remembered seeing her at a family dinner 6 months ago, looking uncomfortable and out of place as Alara and Julian discussed yacht clubs and summering in the Hamptons. I found Chloe's number in my old address book and dialed it, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Hello?" "Chloe, dear, it's Imani, Ilara's grandmother." There was a pause, and then a warmth that felt genuine. "Mrs. Washington, it's so good to hear from you. How are you?" "I've been better, Chloe. Listen, I know this is a strange request, but I need to ask you for a favor. It's about Alara." The warmth in her voice vanished, replaced by a guarded tone. "Is everything okay?" "No, it's not," I said, deciding that directness was my only option. "I'm worried about her. I'm worried about this wedding, and I'm worried about Julian." The silence on the other end was so complete, I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You should be." Those 3 words were all the confirmation I needed. A dam of frustration and fear seemed to break inside her. She told me how Julian had systematically isolated Ilara from her old friends, subtly mocking them as unsophisticated and unambitious. She spoke of how Ilara had changed, her laughter becoming brittle, her kindness replaced with a constant, anxious striving for an ideal Julian had defined. "He's like a personality coach," But a toxic one, Chloe said, her voice trembling with anger. He's convinced her that her entire past, including her family, is something to be overcome, not cherished. He calls it leveling up. I call it erasing herself. Chloe, I need to know more about him, I pressed, my voice gentle but firm. Where does he come from? What's his story? That's the thing, Mrs. Washington, she said. Nobody really knows. He says his family is in Europe, very private. He laughs off questions about his college days. It's all very vague. But there's one thing, something Ilara let slip a few months ago. She said Julian was making a big investment in some kind of tech startup, a sure thing that was going to make them set for life. She was so excited about it. But when I asked for the name of the company, she got defensive and changed the subject. Julian had clearly told her not to talk about it. A tech startup. An investment banker with a mysterious past. It felt like a plot from a cheap novel. But here it was, playing out in my own family. Chloe, can you find out the name of that company? Anything at all? It could be important. I can try, she said, her voice gaining a bit of resolve. Ilara still sends me texts sometimes, usually when she's upset with Julian. She lets things slip. I'll see what I can do. We hung up, and I felt the first glimmer of hope. I was no longer alone in this. But the conversation had also deepened my sense of dread. Julian wasn't just a snob. He was a manipulator. A man who shrouded himself in secrets. What was he hiding? And why was this wedding so critical to his plans? A week later, just as I was beginning to think Chloe had hit a dead end, a text message lit up my phone. It was from an unknown number. The message was simple. Company name is Innovate Futures LLC. Be careful, Mrs. W. I have a bad feeling about this. I stared at the name. Innovate Futures LLC. It sounded impressive and utterly meaningless, a perfect vessel for a con man. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I began to search. The company had a website, just as polished and vague as Julian's LinkedIn profile. It promised to be at the forefront of disruptive AI technology and featured stock photos of diverse, smiling professionals in a modern office. But when I ran a search for its corporate registration, my blood ran cold. Innovate Futures LLC was registered not in a tech hub like Silicon Valley or New York, but in Delaware, a state notorious for its corporate secrecy laws. And the registration was only 4 months old. This wasn't an established company. It was a brand new shell, created just as the wedding planning was kicking into high gear. A cold, terrifying thought began to form in my mind. What if the $90,000 wedding wasn't the goal? What if it was just a means to an end? What if this elaborate performance of wealth was designed to attract something far more valuable than my savings? As if on cue, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole, and my heart leaped into my throat. It was Ilara and Julian, standing on my doorstep, a bouquet of lilies in his hand, and a practiced, apologetic smile on Ilara's face. They had come to do damage control. They had come to ensure the money tap remained open, and I knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that I had to let them in. I had to play my part in their charade to gather more information, even if it meant sitting across from the man I was beginning to suspect was a predator, a wolf dressed in a $1,000 suit. I smoothed my apron, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The performance was about to begin. Grandma! Ilara's voice was a confection of forced sweetness, the kind of tone that sets your teeth on edge. She lunged forward to hug me, but it was a brittle, air-filled embrace, all sharp angles and expensive perfume. Julian stood behind her, holding the bouquet of funereal white lilies like a trophy. His smile was a thin, predatory slash in his handsome face. Imani, he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "We were in the neighborhood and wanted to drop these off. A small thank you for your incredible generosity." He stepped inside, his eyes sweeping across my living room, taking in the worn but comfortable furniture, the framed family photos, the faint scent of lemon polish and old wood. It wasn't a glance of appreciation. It was an assessment, a quiet act of judgment. He was weighing and measuring everything, including me, and finding it all wanting. "They're lovely, Julian," I said, taking the flowers and moving toward the kitchen to find a vase. "Though I've always been more of a fan of peonies, they have more substance." The subtle barb sailed right over Ilara's head, but I saw a flicker of something, annoyance, in Julian's eyes. He wasn't used to people, especially old women in aprons, who didn't simply accept his pronouncements of taste. They followed me into the kitchen, Ilara chattering nervously about the wedding plans. "The caterer is doing a tasting for us next week, Grandma. You would not believe the menu. They're deconstructing a caprese salad into a single, transparent sphere. It's more like art than food." "It sounds expensive," I said, carefully trimming the lily stems. "It's an investment, Imani," Julian corrected gently, leaning against the doorframe as if he owned it. "This wedding is the first major social event of our lives together. The people attending are the future of this city. Investors, developers, philanthropists. The impression we make will pay dividends for years to come." "I see," I said, my voice neutral. "So the food isn't for eating, it's for impressing." His smile tightened. "You have a wonderfully pragmatic way of looking at things." The subtext was clear. "You have a wonderfully simple, unsophisticated mind." I decided to play the part he'd cast for me. "Well, at my age, you learn to appreciate things for what they are, not what they pretend to be. A salad should be a salad." I turned to Ilara, changing the subject. "So tell me, dear, how is your father? I spoke to him the other night." "He sounded stressed." Ilara's face clouded over for a second. "Daddy's fine. He's just worried about you, that's all. He was afraid you were upset about the guest list." "I'm not upset," I lied smoothly. "I'm just a bit old-fashioned. I'm sure you and Julian know what's best." This was the reassurance they had come for. I saw Ilara's shoulders relax. She shot a triumphant little glance at Julian, a look that said, "See, I told you she'd come around." They stayed for another 20 minutes, their conversation a masterclass in condescension. They talked about their upcoming trip to Monaco for a pre-honeymoon, the bespoke suits Julian was having tailored in London, and their plans to join an exclusive country club with a $50,000 initiation fee. They weren't talking to me, they were performing for me, dazzling the simple old woman with the sheer scale of their magnificent future, a future she was privileged to be funding. All the while, I smiled, nodded, and asked simple questions, letting them believe I was completely captivated. But my mind was racing, connecting dots. The high-stakes wedding, the networking, the urgent need for a flawless public image, and the mysterious brand-new tech company. Julian wasn't just building a life, he was building a legend. He was creating a persona of immense wealth and success, and this wedding was his coronation. The question remained, why? What was the lie this elaborate truth was meant to cover? As they prepared to leave, Julian paused by the mantelpiece in the living room. He picked up the silver-framed photograph of David and me on our wedding day. It was my most treasured possession. In the photo, we are young, hopeful, and our faces are alight with a love that needed no audience, no validation. "You two were a handsome couple," Julian said, his thumb tracing the edge of the frame. "A different time, of course. Simpler." He placed the photograph back on the mantel, but his hand slipped, or he pretended it did. The frame tumbled forward, crashing onto the stone hearth below. The glass shattered, a spiderweb of cracks spreading across our smiling faces. A shard nicked the edge of the photograph itself, leaving a tiny, jagged tear on David's cheek. My breath hitched. It was a small thing, a clumsy accident, but it felt like a deliberate act of violation. It was a desecration. "Oh my God!" Ilara gasped, rushing forward. "Julian, be careful." "Terribly sorry," he said, bending down and making a show of picking up the larger pieces of glass. His apology was immediate and smooth, but his eyes, when they met mine for a fleeting second, held a cold, challenging gleam. There was no remorse in them. There was only a quiet warning. It was a power play, a subtle but unmistakable act of intimidation. He was showing me that he could touch and break the things I held most sacred. He was reminding me who was in control. My heart hammered against my ribs, a cold dread washing over me. This man wasn't just a manipulator. He wasn't just a con artist. There was a cruelty in him, a casual disregard for anything and anyone that stood in his way. He saw my love for my husband, my family, my past, as a weakness to be exploited. He had shattered the image of my past, and in his eyes, I saw the promise that he would not hesitate to shatter my future too. I looked down at the broken frame, at the tear on my husband's face, and I knew this was no longer a game of money or respect. This was a fight for survival. He had made a grave mistake. He thought he had shown me his power. Instead, he had shown me his vulnerability. He had shown me that his greatest weapon was fear. And I, a woman who had buried a husband and stared down death itself, was not afraid. I was furious. As Ilara fussed over the broken glass, I met Julian's gaze over her bowed head. I held it, my expression unreadable, my will a wall of iron. In that moment, he knew, and I knew, that the pleasantries were over. He had drawn a line, and I was about to cross it with the full force of a woman who had nothing left to lose and a legacy to protect. He thought he was a wolf. He was about to find out what it felt like to be hunted by a lioness. The image of my husband's smiling face, torn by a shard of glass, became the focal point of my cold, simmering rage. Julian's accident was a message, and I had received it loud and clear. He believed he could break me, that he could intimidate an old woman into silent compliance. For 3 days, I let that message hang in the air. I didn't call. I didn't text. I let them wonder. I knew that my silence would be more unnerving to them than any angry outburst. In that silence, I worked. I was no longer just a curious grandmother. I was a hunter on the trail. My first call was back to Bernard, my financial advisor. "Bernard," I said, my voice clipped and precise. "I need a private investigator, the best you know. Someone discreet, thorough, and not afraid to dig into financial records." There was a moment of silence. "Imani, is everything all right? This sounds serious." "It is," I said. "I'm making an investment of $90,000, and I've come to believe my beneficiaries may not be who they say they are. I need a full background report on a Mr. Julian Croft. I want to know everything: his family, his education, his credit history, his tax returns. I want to know the name of his first pet. Leave no stone unturned." I gave him the name of the shell company Chloe had found, Innovate Futures, LLC. "Start there," I instructed. The investigator, a former financial crimes detective named Frank, was on the phone with me within the hour. He was all business, his questions sharp and to the point. He didn't ask why, he only asked what and who. I felt a sense of relief, of offloading a burden to a professional. While Frank began his dig, I received another text from Chloe. Something weird is happening. Alara is freaking out. Julian keeps taking calls in another room. She mentioned something about a margin call? Does that mean anything? A margin call. The term jolted me. David had dabbled in stocks, and he'd explained it to me once. It's what happens when you borrow money to invest, and the value of your investment drops. Your broker demands you put up more money immediately, or they sell your assets to cover the loan. It was a sign of a gambler in deep trouble. Julian wasn't a savvy investor. He was a desperate one. Innovate Futures wasn't a sure thing. It was a Hail Mary. The pieces were beginning to form a terrifying picture. The pressure was mounting on Julian. And the wedding, this grand performance of wealth and stability, was his lifeline. He needed to project success to attract new money, new investors, to cover the old debts. And he needed my $90,000, not for canapés and couture, but for something far more urgent. He was using my family's legacy as collateral in his high-stakes poker game. The full, devastating truth arrived on a Friday afternoon in a single, encrypted email from Frank, the investigator. The subject line was just 2 words. Report, Croft J. My granddaughter wasn't planning a wedding. She was financing a bailout, and the scale of the deception was breathtaking. Frank's report was methodical, brutal, and irrefutable. Julian Croft was a fiction. He was born Julian O'Malley from a working-class family in Ohio. There was no private European family. His father was a plumber, his mother a cashier. There was no degree from a prestigious business school. He had dropped out of a community college after 2 semesters. The boutique investment firm where he was a vice president? It was a one-man operation registered to a P.O. box, with no clients and no assets. It was a prop. But the financial records were the true bombshell. Julian O'Malley was drowning in debt. Over $200,000 in personal loans, credit card debt, and, most damning of all, a massive high-interest loan from a private lending firm, the source of his margin call. He had used that money to make a single, wildly speculative bet on a volatile cryptocurrency through his shell company, Innovate Futures. And the bet had gone catastrophically wrong. The currency's value had plummeted, and his lenders were calling in their markers. He was on the verge of total collapse. The $90,000 wedding was his last, desperate gambit. It was designed to do 2 things. First, to create a public spectacle of wealth that would allow him to solicit new funds from the unsuspecting investors on his guest list, whom he could pay back his old lenders with. Second, and more immediately, he needed a cash infusion. My $90,000. Frank had even uncovered emails between Julian and the wedding planner. They discussed vendor payment schedules that were designed to get as much cash into Julian's hands as quickly as possible, through kickbacks and inflated invoices that I would unwittingly pay. He wasn't marrying Ilara. He was liquidating her. He was using her love, her trust, and her family's legacy as a bridge loan to save himself from financial ruin. And Ilara? Was she a victim or a co-conspirator? Frank's report answered that too. He had found text messages between Ilara and Julian, obtained legally through a source. In them, Julian was vague, telling her about cash flow problems and the importance of projecting confidence. He'd framed it as a temporary hurdle on their path to greatness. Ilara's replies were filled with anxiety, but also a desperate willingness to believe. Whatever you need, Julian. I trust you. We're a team. She wasn't a co-conspirator. She was a willing mark, the most devoted member of her own cult of personality. I sat back in my chair, the words on the screen blurring. The air in the room felt thick, heavy. I could barely breathe. The betrayal was so complete, so monstrous. It was almost sublime. This man had targeted my family. He had preyed on my granddaughter's insecurities, turning her into a puppet in his sordid drama. He had enlisted my own son as an unwitting accomplice. He had stood in my house, broken a sacred memory, and lied to my face while planning to steal the last of my husband's legacy. If you've ever discovered a truth so ugly it changed your entire world, hit that subscribe button. Because you're not alone, and knowing what's coming is the only way to protect yourself. I closed the laptop. The quiet fury from before had now crystallized into something hard and sharp as a diamond. My grief was gone. My fear was gone. All that remained was a singular, unwavering purpose. The lesson I had planned was no longer sufficient. This wasn't a matter of teaching respect. This was a matter of delivering justice. Julian O'Malley thought he was playing a game of finance. He had no idea I was about to change the rules. He wanted a performance? I would give him a grand finale he would never forget. My next phone call was not to Samuel, not to Ilara, not even to Chloe. It was to my lawyer. "Eleanor," I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. "I need you to draw up some documents, and I need you to be available next Saturday evening. You're going to be a guest at a rehearsal dinner." The investigator's report was a loaded weapon, and I spent the weekend learning how to handle it. I read it over and over, memorizing the names, the dates, the figures. I was no longer a grieving widow. I was a general preparing for battle. The rage I felt was a clean, cold fire, burning away all the extraneous emotions, the hurt, the sadness, the self-pity. All that was left was the sharp, brilliant clarity of purpose. Julian had built a house of cards, and I was about to remove the one at the very bottom. But I knew I couldn't do it alone. The next phase of my plan required an ally, however reluctant. I had to confront my son. I called Samuel on Monday morning. "Samuel, I need you to come to the house this evening, after work, and I need you to come alone." My tone left no room for argument. It was not a request. He arrived at 6 o'clock, his face a mask of weary apprehension. He probably expected another lecture, another emotional plea about the wedding. He was not prepared for what I had in store for him. I didn't offer him a drink. I didn't ask about his day. I led him into David's study and gestured for him to sit in the chair opposite the desk. I remained standing. It was a subtle shift in our dynamic, but a powerful one. I was no longer just his mother. I was an authority. I opened my laptop, turned the screen toward him, and said, "Read this." On the screen was the first page of Frank's report, summarizing Julian's true identity and his mountain of debt. I watched Samuel's face as he read. I saw the confusion morph into disbelief, then into a dawning, sickening horror. His skin went pale, a pasty gray. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading question. "Mom, what is this? This has to be some kind of mistake." "It's not a mistake, Samuel," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "It's a background check. It's the due diligence you should have done before you allowed this predator to get his hooks into your daughter." I clicked to the next page, showing the shell company registration. Then the next, detailing the high-interest loans. Then the next, showing the catastrophic losses in his cryptocurrency gamble. With each click, another layer of his willful ignorance was stripped away. He wasn't just seeing Julian's lies, he was seeing his own failure, his own complicity, laid bare in black and white. "He's using her?" Samuel whispered, the words catching in his throat. "He's using all of us." "Yes," I said. "He is. The $90,000 wedding isn't a celebration. It's a lifeline. It's a theatrical production designed to lure new investors and to use my money to pay off his margin calls. Your daughter is not a bride-to-be." She is a business asset." Samuel put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. It was the sound of a man's world crumbling around him. The sound of a father realizing he has led his own child to the slaughter. I felt a pang of pity, but I suppressed it. This was not the time for comfort. This was the time for accountability. I let him weep for a full minute. When his sobs subsided into shuddering breaths, I spoke again. "This is the man you defended to me? This is the different world you told me I didn't understand. You were so eager to see your daughter level up, as he calls it, that you didn't bother to check if the ladder she was climbing was resting on solid ground. You were willing to sacrifice my dignity for her social advancement, and in doing so, you handed her over to a con man who is about to destroy her." His head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a desperate defensive anger. "I didn't know." "No, you didn't," I agreed calmly. "But you chose not to know. You chose to be dazzled. You chose to look the other way when things didn't add up. You accepted the vague stories and the polished lies because the fantasy was more comfortable than the truth. That is on you, Samuel." The fight went out of him as quickly as it had appeared. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice small, broken. It was the first time he had said, "we." A crucial shift. He was no longer on their side. He was back on mine. This was the moment I had been waiting for. "First," I said, my voice taking on a new tone of command, "you are going to stop being a passive observer in your own life. Second, you are going to help me protect your daughter and what's left of our family's resources. And third, you are going to do exactly as I say, without question. Do you understand?" He nodded, his eyes fixed on mine. He looked like a lost child, but for the first time in a long time, he was looking to the right place for direction. "The wedding is in 10 days, I continued. "The rehearsal dinner is this Saturday. We are not going to stop it. We are not going to confront them. We are going to let them walk further into the trap. I have already authorized another $20,000 from the trust for the caterer and the florist. Julian will see the money flowing. He will believe he has won. He will feel safe." "But Mom, that's $20,000. "It's the cost of the lesson, Samuel, and it's a bargain, considering the alternative. On Saturday night, at the rehearsal dinner, at the Harbor Grand Estate, in front of all the important people Julian is trying to impress, we are going to expose him for exactly what he is." I explained the plan. I told him about my lawyer, Eleanor, and the documents she was preparing. I told him about the other calls I had made, one to the private lending firm Julian owed money to, and another to a contact I had at the state's Financial Crimes Division. I was not just dismantling a wedding, I was orchestrating a multi-front assault. Samuel listened, his expression shifting from despair to a kind of terrified awe. He was seeing a side of his quiet gardening mother he never knew existed. "You need to play your part," I told him. "You will be the proud, happy father of the bride. You will smile. You will make toasts. You will give them no reason to suspect that anything is wrong. You will lead the lamb to the altar, knowing that we are waiting there not with a blessing, but with a blade." The color had returned to his face, a flush of adrenaline and purpose. The weakness that had defined him for the past year was being burned away, replaced by the righteous anger of a father whose child has been threatened. "He won't get away with this," Samuel said, his voice a low growl. "No," I agreed. "He won't." He stood up, and for the first time, he looked me in the eye, not as a son looks at his mother, but as one adult looks at another. An equal, an ally. "What do you need me to do first?" he asked. The question was a balm on my wounded heart. My son had come home. The battle was not yet won, but I was no longer fighting it alone. As he left my house that night, I felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. The dread was gone. The cold anger remained, but it was now tempered with a sense of grim satisfaction. Julian O'Malley thought he was a master manipulator, a puppeteer pulling the strings of a naive family. He had no idea that we were about to cut his strings, burn his stage, and bring the entire theater crashing down around him. The trap was set. The bait was taken, and the hunter was now simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The night of the rehearsal dinner was unseasonably warm for October, the air thick with a humidity that felt like unbreathed tension. I drove to the Harbor Grand Estate with Samuel beside me. His hands clenched so tightly on his knees that his knuckles were white. He was wearing a new suit, his face a carefully composed mask of paternal pride. To any observer, we were the picture of a supportive family, ready to celebrate. But beneath the surface, we were a two-person strike team, moving into position. The estate's ballroom was a study in ostentatious wealth. Towering floral arrangements bled perfume into the air. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables draped in silk, and a string quartet played softly in a corner. There were about 50 guests, a curated collection of the city's nouveau riche, all looking sleek and predatory in their expensive clothes. They were the audience for Julian's grand performance, and at the center of it all stood Julian and Ilara. Ilara was radiant in a simple white dress, her face flushed with excitement. She looked happy, truly happy, and for a moment, my heart ached. She was a fool, but she was my fool, my granddaughter, and she was about to have her heart shattered on the marble floor of this opulent room. Julian was in his element. He moved through the crowd with an easy, practiced charm, one hand on Ilara's back, the other holding a glass of champagne. He was laughing, shaking hands, clapping men on the back. He was the king in his court, the master of his universe. He saw Samuel and me enter, and his smile widened. He strode over, a conquering hero greeting his loyal subjects. "Imani, Samuel, you made it. Magnificent, isn't it?" he said, gesturing around the room. "Just the beginning." "It's breathtaking, Julian," I said, my voice a perfect imitation of an awestruck old woman. He patted Samuel on the shoulder. "Your daughter has impeccable taste, my friend. You must be so proud." "Words can't express," Samuel said, his voice tight. The dinner began. The food, as Ilara had promised, was more art than substance, tiny, architectural creations on oversized plates. The conversation was a drone of stock portfolios, real estate deals, and summer plans in Tuscany. I sat silently, a ghost at the feast, watching, waiting. After the main course, Julian stood, tapping a glass with his fork. The room fell silent. "My friends," he began, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "Thank you all for being here. To look around this room and see so many people who believe in us, in our future, it's humbling." He looked at Ilara, his eyes shining with what an amateur would call love. I knew it was the look of a prospector gazing at a rich vein of gold. "And to my beautiful Ilara, you have made me the luckiest man alive. You are my partner, my inspiration, my future." He raised his glass. "To the future." The room echoed with the toast. "To the future." It was my cue. As the applause died down, a side door to the ballroom opened. Two figures stepped inside. The first was my lawyer, Eleanor, a sharp, formidable woman in a dark suit carrying a leather briefcase. The second was a man I didn't recognize, but whose grim expression and official-looking badge clipped to his belt announced his purpose. He was from the state's Financial Crimes Division. They stood at the entrance for a moment, their presence a sudden, jarring note in the symphony of self-congratulation. A ripple of confusion went through the room. Julian's smile faltered. He stared at the newcomers, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Eleanor began to walk toward the head table, her heels clicking purposefully on the marble floor. The investigator followed a few steps behind her. Every eye in the room was now on them. They stopped directly in front of Julian. "Mr. Julian Croft?" Eleanor asked, her voice clear and cutting, carrying to every corner of the silent room. Julian's face was a mask of confusion. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "My name is Eleanor Vance. I am the legal representative for Mrs. Imani Washington." She gestured toward me. I gave a small, polite nod. A murmur went through the crowd. "And this," Eleanor continued, indicating the man beside her, "is Investigator Miller from the State Securities Division. He has some questions for you regarding a company called Innovate Futures, LLC." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. The color drained from Julian's face. He looked like he had been physically struck. Ilara stared at him, then at Eleanor, her happy, flushed expression collapsing into bewilderment. "What's going on?" she whispered. "Julian?" But Julian wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me, and in his eyes, I saw it all. The dawning realization, the fury, the terror. He finally understood. This wasn't a celebration. It was an execution, and I was the executioner. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Julian stammered, his voice losing its smooth, confident timbre. "Perhaps we could discuss this in private." "I think not," Eleanor said coolly. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick sheaf of documents. "Mr. Croft, or perhaps I should say, Mr. O'Malley. We have here a comprehensive report detailing your outstanding debts of over $200,000 to multiple creditors. We have evidence of the shell corporation you established to solicit fraudulent investments. And we have records of your attempts to use this wedding and my client's funds to secure capital to cover your catastrophic investment losses." She placed the documents on the table with a soft thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. "Furthermore," she said, her voice rising slightly, "we have been in contact with your primary lender, a Mr. Petrov. He was very interested to learn about your current liquidity problems. In fact, I believe he's waiting outside." As if on cue, the doors opened again. This time, it was a large, imposing man in an ill-fitting suit, flanked by two even larger men. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Julian with the cold, dead focus of a shark. "Julian, my boy," the man said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "We need to have a chat about my money." The room erupted. People were standing, whispering, staring. The illusion was shattered. The king was naked. The carefully constructed world of Julian Croft had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes. Ilara was staring at the documents on the table, then at Julian, her face a canvas of utter devastation. The man she loved, the future she had dreamed of, it was all a lie, a cheap, tawdry fiction. She looked at him, her lips forming a single, silent question. Why? Julian didn't answer. He was cornered, trapped between my lawyer, a state investigator, and a loan shark who looked ready to break his kneecaps. He shot one last venomous look at me, a look of pure, undiluted hatred. Then he did the only thing a coward could do. He turned and ran. He literally shoved past a waiter and bolted for a service exit, disappearing into the night. The large man, Petrov, barked an order to his 2 thugs, who lumbered after him. The room was in chaos. The party was over. The guests, the important people, were scrambling for the exits, not wanting to be associated with the stench of scandal. They scattered like roaches when the lights come on. In the wreckage, only a few of us remained. Me, Samuel, and Ilara, who had sunk into her chair, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with silent, heartbreaking sobs. The $90,000 wedding was in ruins. The dream was dead. The lesson, in all its brutal, unforgiving clarity, had been delivered. I walked over to the table and stood before my granddaughter. I didn't touch her. I didn't offer a word of comfort. I simply waited. After a long moment, she lifted her head. Her face was streaked with tears and mascara, her eyes hollow with a pain so profound it was almost physical. She looked at me, and in her gaze, there was no anger, no blame. There was only the devastating, soul-crushing weight of the truth. "You knew," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "You knew all along." "Yes," I said softly, "I knew." The weeks that followed the disastrous rehearsal dinner were a landscape of quiet devastation. The Harbor Grand Estate was a flurry of lawyers and canceled contracts. Julian, as it turned out, had been apprehended by Petrov's men in the parking lot and had agreed to a very stringent repayment plan. He vanished from our lives as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind a wake of financial ruin and broken trust. The story became the talk of the town, a juicy piece of gossip for the very people whose approval Ilara had so desperately craved. She had become a cautionary tale. Ilara retreated into a cocoon of shame. She moved back into her childhood bedroom in Samuel's house, refusing to see or speak to anyone. Samuel, now fully awake to his own failings, tried to reach her, but she walled him out. He told me she would just lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, a ghost in her own life. I gave her space. The kind of wound she had suffered doesn't heal with platitudes or forced comfort. It requires time, silence, and a painful internal reckoning. I knew she would have to find her own way back to the world, and she would have to do it alone. I returned to my quiet life, to my garden, to the familiar rhythms that had sustained me for 74 years. The trust I had established was dissolved. The remaining funds returned to my accounts. The final cost of the wedding had been just under $50,000 in non-refundable deposits and legal fees. A steep price, but as I looked around at the quiet integrity of my life, I knew it was a bargain. I had bought my granddaughter's freedom from a predator and my son's return from the wilderness of his own ambition. One crisp November afternoon, about a month after the incident, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Ilara standing on my porch. She was thin, her face pale, the vibrant confidence she once wore like a second skin completely gone. She was dressed not in a designer outfit, but in a simple pair of jeans and a gray sweater. She looked, for the first time in years, like herself. Like the girl I remembered. She didn't speak. She just looked at me, her eyes brimming with a sorrow so deep it seemed ancient. And in that look, I saw everything. The apology, the regret, the shame, the flicker of a desperate hope for something she wasn't sure she deserved. "Can I come in, Grandma?" she asked, her voice quiet, fragile. "The door's open," I said simply. She followed me into the kitchen, the same kitchen where she and Julian had once stood, condescending to me about their grand future. She sat at the small wooden table where I ate my breakfast every morning. I poured her a cup of tea, my hands steady. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Finally, she spoke. Her voice a near whisper. "I was so stupid." It was not a question, it was a confession. "You were," I agreed, my voice gentle. "You were blinded by a fantasy. Many people are." "He told me I was special," she said, staring into her teacup. "That I was destined for more than this." She gestured vaguely around my small, comfortable kitchen. "He said my background was a cage, and he was the one who could set me free. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. And what do you believe now? I asked. She looked up, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. I believe I was already free, she whispered. I just didn't know it. I had a family that loved me, a history that was real. And I tried to trade it all for a stage set, for a lie. You were ashamed of us, I stated, not as an accusation, but as a fact that needed to be spoken aloud. You were ashamed of me. She flinched, but she didn't deny it. Yes, she said, the word tearing from her. I was. Julian made me see you, see Dad, see this house, as obstacles, as things to be overcome. He made me feel like your love was a weight holding me down, and his was a pair of wings. His wasn't love, Ilara, I said softly. It was a business transaction. He was acquiring an asset. Real love doesn't ask you to erase your past. It asks you to share it. We sat in silence again. She was processing, grieving not just for the man she thought she loved, but for the person she had become in her pursuit of him. What you did at the dinner, she finally said, her voice shaking. It was cruel. Yes, I said. It was. It was a surgical cruelty. Sometimes, the only way to save a person from a gangrenous limb is to cut it off. It's brutal, it's painful, but it's better than letting the poison spread to the heart. She looked at me, a deep and searching look. You did it to save me. I did it to save us, I corrected. I did it because your grandfather didn't work his fingers to the bone so that his legacy could be used to bail out a con man from Ohio. I did it because my son needed to remember what it means to be a father. And yes, I did it because the girl who used to help me plant roses in the garden was still in there somewhere, and she deserved better. She finally broke. The sobs came then, not the performative tears of a disappointed bride, but the deep, ragged, cleansing sobs of someone who has finally seen themselves clearly. I moved around the table, and for the first time, I put my arms around her. I held my granddaughter as she wept for her lost innocence, for her profound foolishness, and for the simple, honest love she had almost thrown away. That day was the beginning. It was not a magical fix. Trust, once shattered, has to be rebuilt piece by piece, like a broken mosaic. But it was a start. Ilara moved out of her father's house and into a small apartment of her own. She got a simple job at a local library. She started spending Sundays with me, not talking about the past, but simply being present, helping me in the garden, learning the names of the flowers again. She and Samuel began to talk, their conversations awkward at first, but slowly, painfully, mending the tear in their relationship. One afternoon, as we were pruning the rose bushes, she paused, her hands in the dirt. You know, Grandma, she said thoughtfully, I used to think being old-fashioned was an insult, a limitation, but I think I'm starting to understand. It's not about being stuck in the past. It's about holding on to the things that last. I smiled, the first truly warm smile I had felt in months. My granddaughter had finally learned the most important lesson of all, the one that can never be itemized on an invoice. She had learned the difference between price and value. The wedding that never happened taught us all something. It taught Ilara that the most valuable things in life are not for sale. It taught Samuel that a father's first duty is to protect, not to please. And it taught me that sometimes the most profound act of love is not to give people what they want, but to give them what they need, even if it breaks their heart to receive it. Real love isn't a performance, it's a foundation, and it is the only thing in this fleeting world that is truly worth its price. If this story taught you something about the true meaning of family, share it with someone you love. And tell me in the comments, what is the one old-fashioned value you believe the world needs more of today? Thank you for listening.